So for those of you who are fans of kind of big political TV shows, this kind of last month of French politics felt like we just went through roughly 3 seasons of House of Cards.
Welcome back to the Space Salvi Institute podcast. I'm Andrew Petiprin with Bobby Mixa. Bobby, how are you?
Good, Andrew. Just in the northeast corner of Poland, right by Lithuania. So by the Suwałki Gap.
And I believe not far from a little tiny piece of Russia also. Am I correct?
Actually, I'm in a town that was, actually right by Russia there. But actually the town I'm in was part of Russia right before or during World War One. And then literally like a kilometer north was Germany. So I'm right there at the border. But yeah, the Russian oblast is right next door.
The old East Prussia, right, as the Germans called it. So
That's right.
yeah. Well, wonderful. I'm so glad that you're well. And we've been kind of a little sporadic with our podcasting this summer, but we're really delighted to have some great guests lined up over the next few weeks. And we're particularly happy to be talking today to François Valentin. François Valentin, I don't know whether I should say it French or English, but we'll just kind of anglicize it a little bit. But we're really, really delighted to have François with us today. He is a French politics analyst and is host of the Uncommon Decency podcast, which is where I first discovered François. And I know that, Bobby, I shared that podcast with you, and we've both become admirers of it. And we've learned a lot, I think, about the kind of contemporary European political situation by listening to François and his colleagues. So let's get right into it. François, how are you?
I'm doing super well. I'm currently speaking to you from good old rainy London, but very happy to be here. And I'm very impressed by the work you're putting together. There seems to be like a real sense of mission and purpose, and that's something we kind of also wanted to have in Uncommon Decency. And it kind of, I think when you're more than a podcast, of course, but when there is that kind of purpose, it kind of really shows through, and it makes a difference.
Yeah, you've had some really big deal guests on your podcast as well. It's been really, really interesting. It's actually something Bobby and I have discovered that, it doesn't hurt to ask. And when you ask people if they want to talk to you, very often they do. For example, go ahead.
Yeah.
Well, you had, for example, and actually the way that I found you was you and your colleagues had a conversation with Pierre Manon in English, which is he doesn't often give interviews in English, and so anyway, from there I've discovered all kinds of other interesting people you've talked to. So it's really a wonderful thing. I hope our listeners will check out your work there.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Yeah, well, let's talk about the current situation in Europe. It has been a very eventful summer, to say the least, in terms of European politics. There was a big election for sort of European-wide election, which resulted in the president of France, President Macron, calling for a snap election for the French Parliament. And we're speaking to you right after the second weekend of the election has taken place. Delivering a somewhat surprising result, maybe, that the National Rally, or the kind of the so-called far right party, didn't win exactly. But it is what actually has happened to our listeners. Maybe you could explain.
So for those of you who are fans of kind of big political TV shows, this kind of last month of French politics felt like we just went through roughly 3 seasons of House of Cards. Essentially, things were setting up for a kind of pretty unsurprising European election. So the European election is a European-wide election. It is made through a kind of proportional voting system. It varies slightly across countries, but it's a proportional system. And usually, in a country like France, where we don't get proportional elections, the electorate uses that to kind of lash out and punish incumbents, vote for kind of smaller parties which they don't usually like to vote for, the Greens, for example, or like sporadically kind of smaller nationalist parties of the 90s and so on. So we were heading towards, a not very surprising defeat of Macron's party, which is Renaissance/Ensemble. It changes weekly these days. And that was going to be it, or so we thought. No, I happened actually to take so I took a plane that evening of the European elections. I think the results were announced at 8 p.m. My flight took off at like 8:05 or something. So I missed the big announcement, which was like at 8:15. Macron announced that he was dissolving parliament. He didn't have to. Yes, the defeat was embarrassing, but nothing constitutionally says that a kind of embarrassing election forces a president to call a snap election. So this was, his own decision, entirely his own decision. And so he decided, you know what, we're going to mix things up, shake it up. And I'm still not sure as to why. There's a lot of kind of explanations for it, some of them veering on the kind of borderline conspiratorial. None of them are very convincing, but that's because Macron got punished pretty hard in the election. So kind of retrospectively, it looks like a very dumb decision. But I think he actually thought he had a chance of, somehow winning it or kind of enhancing his majority or kind of shaking the whole political scene in a way that'd be favorable to him. That's not quite what happened. So we had, as a result of his snap election, a lot of chaos. So he announced a snap election to everyone's surprise. There's only a month of campaigning, which is very short. Macron's thinking probably was that the left, who essentially spent the last year kind of insulting each other over issues around Gaza. There's been on the kind of far left around Jean-Luc Mélenchon, La France Insoumise. There's been a lot kind of borderline anti-Semitic or more than borderline anti-Semitic comments, which has created a lot of issues with kind of more moderate elements of the left. And so, they had made a coalition together in 2022 to kind of split up the different seats across France. And the thinking was they hate each other too much now, it's not going to happen. But to everyone's surprise, in like 48 hours, they got together, they had like a governing platform, and then like the Nouveau Front Populaire, which is a reference to a very famous government from the 1930s, which kind of got us our first paid vacation. It got us I think we went to a 45-hour, 48-hour work week. So it's a pretty symbolic moment in French history, especially of the history of the left. So that happened on the left. Then on the right, the kind of Gaullist centre-right party, the party of Jacques Chirac, of Charles de Gaulle, like all of these people, who has been kind of lingering in kind of second division of French politics for the last decade or so, has announced, the president of that party announced, you know what, this is very chaotic. I'm afraid I'm not going to get my seat. So you know what, let's join Marine Le Pen, create some kind of governing platform together. The issue was he's a president of a party, but the rest of the bigwigs said, no way, we would rather lose our seats than join Marine Le Pen. And so they decided to kind of split. But the issue is the president still is technically the president of that party, but no one is following him. So at some point you got a very fun kind of social media civil war where one side had the Facebook account and the other the Twitter account, which made for very fun comments. We even had like a siege of a party where the president was kind of locked in his party and pretending to do work without a computer because the computers had been removed. So the whole thing was quite funny. It was House of Cards veering into the office at times, but that was quite interesting. And so the whole campaign was driven by the possibility that the far right, or I prefer saying the nationalists of Assemblée Nationale, could have a government. Marine Le Pen is a kind of the leader of that movement, but the prime minister would have been Jordan Bardella, who's this kind of very young 28-year-old MEP. He's currently in Brussels. So he was going to be the next prime minister if Assemblée Nationale had a majority. And for most of the election, that was the theme of it. People were either enthusiastic about it or afraid about it. The pollsters kind of were struggling to understand how many seats each party would get, because this is a very tricky, kind of pretty unique electoral model. So they're trying to model how the new French National Assembly would look like. It was very tricky, but some projections said they were around 260, 270, 280, 290, even 300, and you need 289 seats to have an outright majority. So that was a kind of dominant theme throughout the campaign. So what happened then is, kind of dominant question was whether we want Jordan Bardella to be prime minister. And so France's system is quite complicated, but essentially it's a two-round system. In each district, the first two candidates make it to the runoff, and if there is kind of very high participation, sometimes you can get a third candidate, a fourth candidate, even theoretically a fifth candidate. And so then you reach a second round. But what happened is we went from a scenario of quite low participation in 2022 to very high participation in 2024. So we went from having 8 freeway races in 2022 to 8 to 300. So that completely changes the landscape. And all of a sudden, there's kind of races are meant to be more favorable to Rassemblement National because you don't get this kind of everyone but Le Pen kind of coalition emerging. But what happened is the centrists around Macron and the kind of leftists around the different socialist Greens and France Insoumise agreed, okay, we hate each other's guts, but let's agree we will remove each other's candidates to help us beat Rassemblement National tactically. And that's what they did. The question was, would a centrist voter want to vote for Le Nouveau Front Populaire on the left, who was, making the case for an extra 170 billion of spending over the next 3 years? And would a leftist who's been kind of spending the last 7 years criticizing the Macron government accept to vote for a centrist, even of a nationalist? And that was a big uncertainty because the last time in 2022, it didn't work that well. Le Pen wasn't as strong, but it didn't work that well in runoffs. This time, however, it did. People mobilized massively. And so Le Pen, who was promised to get the biggest group in parliament, went from actually having the third biggest group. The first group ended up being kind of united left and then the kind of united centrist coalition. So that was a big surprise of last weekend's results. And so now we're left in a strange situation where you have roughly 3 blocks of equal size, none of them being in a capacity to govern. No one is even near the 289 seats you would need to get a majority. And so you will need some kind of coalition or some kind of minority government, but a minority government that wouldn't be toppled at the first occasion. So this is not in France's culture. Normally, the French electoral system was made for 2 things. In 1958, when Charles de Gaulle came back, he wanted a system which both gave him kind of clear, strong majorities. We want a bit like in the UK, we want to be able to have a governing party, especially because you elect a president. You want that president to be able to kind of implement this program. You don't want to be stuck, as we were in the Fourth Republic and in the Third Republic, with kind of endless parliamentary negotiations. So that was the first objective of the system. The second objective of that kind of electoral system was to stop extremists from getting to power. So essentially, in the first round, you vote for your favorite candidate. In the second round, you essentially vote for the kind of least worst option. And so that second aspect is still working to some extent. People still see the Rassemblement National as being extreme. Whether that's fair or not is another discussion. For a lot of people, when they had to choose between Le Pen and anyone else, said, I'm going to vote for anyone else. So that's working, but the system isn't producing large majorities anymore. And that's tricky because we are not Germany, we are not the Dutch. We don't know how to do coalitions. Our politics tend to be quite confrontational. In Germany, they take a long time between different parties to negotiate. Okay, well, you promise X, we promise Y. Can we find something in the middle? I'll give you that, I'll give you that. You take this position. This is not in our culture at all. And on top of that, there's been a lot of kind of bad blood with the president, who's also a lame duck. So even within his majority, there's a lot of how can I say, tiredness with this kind of style. So the whole thing is very complicated, and anyone's guess is as good as mine as to what's going to happen next. Are we going to get some kind of center-right, center coalition, or are we going to get kind of a center-to-left coalition? Are we going to agree to leave some party, create a minority government, but how long will that government be toppled? You can't have another snap election until at least a year. So we've got at least a year of very interesting political experimentation for a politics junkie. But at the same time, it could be very chaotic.
Yeah. Let me just follow up by asking you a little bit about this party, about the National Rally Party, because, of course, it's often, noticed that it's kind of the evolution of the old National Front. And there was, Jean-Marie Le Pen was this sort of bogeyman in the French electoral system for a long, long time. And I remember back in 2002 when he made it to the presidential runoff and was, he was totally annihilated by Jacques Chirac in the final election. And it was for the very reasons that you've already been saying. I mean, everybody could get behind the idea that they didn't want that guy, that they didn't want that, right? But it seems like, now you wrote an article the other day for Unheard called Emmanuel Macron Can't Keep the Right Out Forever. And it seems like, I noticed in what you were writing and just in my own kind of consumption of some of the stories that have been going around about this latest election, that, I mean, then even though it's true that all of these groups came together to, in a sense, like keep the National Rally from taking power in parliament, but a much more significant force now. I mean, this is not just a kind of, this isn't the old Le Pen situation. And you write, let me just read this quote that you wrote, and then maybe you can take it from here. You said, French public opinion is probably the most right-wing it has been in the history of the French Republic, in the history of the Fifth Republic. And yet France could end up forming one of the most left-wing governments since 1981. So that's part of this chaos that you've just been describing. But where does it go from here, do you think? I mean, in terms of kind of the right and you know, that sentiment among the French people?
It's tricky. You're right. The party we have nowadays is a very different beast from the one that made it to the runoff back in 2002. So a bit of history. Jean-Marie Le Pen is this MP whose career I think goes back to the 1950s. He's still alive. I think he's turning 97, 98, maybe 100 soon. So he's very old at this point. But he's seen it all. You know, he's been around for a long time. For those who are kind of big nerds of kind of French political history, he was next to Pierre Poujade back in the day. And so he was an MP. He fought in Algeria back in the days. And so his kind of political career kind of disappeared for a bit. And then in the 1970s, he created a new party called the Front National. Now, people will point out, and rightfully so, that there's a lot of kind of former collaborationists who were part of that party when he founded it. What they also kind of admit sometimes is that party was kind of a big mess. There was a lot of kind of nostalgics of French Algeria, but also kind of former resistants from World War II. It's kind of big mess of kind of people who were, you know, on the right. They'd be quite kind of, how can I say, kind of small C conservative in some way. That'd be, you know, this is one in America and in the UK progressively you had kind of a neoliberal revolution with Thatcher and Reagan. So this was what this party was. It emerged progressively in the 1980s. And it established itself as a kind of the party of anything to the right of the governing right, so to speak. The issue of that party is also became tarnished quite quickly, in no small part due to Jean-Marie Le Pen making comments who were anti-Semitic, famously calling the gas chambers a point of detail of history. So that party essentially was kind of on the fringes. There's a lot of kind of literature about how François Mitterrand, who was a socialist president who was elected in 1991, also kind of tactfully kind of managed to push them on public media and so on, to kind of split the right. And that was part of their appeal. He kind of also decided 1996 we would have a proportional election. So he kind of managed to push for us on the Front National back then to the forefront. In 2002, it's a bit of an industrial accident because Le Pen makes it to the second round with like 15-16% of the vote, which, I mean, if the left had kind of got its stuff together, they wouldn't have lost in the first round against Le Pen. But essentially, Marine Le Pen takes over from her father. I forget exactly when, probably like 2009 or 10 something. And she's got a party which is kind of an established brand, but kind of basically at its lowest for like the last 20 years. There's been a lot of kind of splits. And so she lacks kind of experienced, qualified politicians. It's a party which is very strong in the southeast of France. It's not so strong elsewhere. It's a party which is kind of very kind of maybe not Catholic, but at least appeals to Catholic values. And so she manages in kind of in a decade to kind of transform this party, make it a lot more working class than it was. So if you look at a map of where France's Rassemblement National MPs come from, a lot of them will come from France's kind of old industrial belt in the north. If you look at all the MPs who were elected with 50% in the first round, they essentially all come from this kind of belt that goes from the Somme basically to like Luxembourg, essentially. That's because she managed to kind of widen her appeal. And she was very big on this kind of cleavage between kind of the winners and losers of globalization. That was her big thing. And it wasn't so much kind of a kind of conservative party in that way. There was huge protest back in 2012 in France of gay marriage. And whereas kind of more centre-right politicians often kind of protested against it, she was kind of a bit uncomfortable with it. There was a huge movement behind it. And so she kind of felt like she had to follow, but it wasn't really her cup of tea. And so you get a party which is kind of much more secular than the party of Jean-Marie Le Pen, which is much more working class. which does quite well. The issue is that you can't just have like a working class party. And when I say working class, to give people kind of an idea, in 2017, Marine Le Pen's party was more working class than the communists in like the 1970s, 1980s. So this is like a huge thing. Kind of many blue collars, former blue collar areas. I'm not People kind of often say this is kind of cities versus countryside or rural urban. It's more complicated than that. It's like yes, you get kind of rural areas, but also kind of small towns. Those towns who kind of aren't connected in kind of global economy. Those towns which essentially kind of rely on a few public services and your cafe. Those kind of areas where your train station has shut down. Those areas where kind of postal offices are maybe you have to drive 50 kilometers to get there and so on. Those kind of places. I'm not talking about kind of farmers in the countryside. It's a bit more kind of ambiguous than that. Or like the second or third ring of French banlieue, for example. This is where they'll be settled. So she's really managed to transform the party. Well, so this was kind of detoxification. She managed to remove most of the kind of blatant anti-Semites. There's been kind of a real change in the kind of front row of personnel, so to speak. So you'll get a lot of people tend to come from the centre right as well. If you look at kind of front row of Le Pen's MPs nowadays, a lot of them used to come from Les Républicains or UMP, or whatever it was called back then. So and it's not just detoxification, but it's also now that she had 2022 she got 89 MPs, which is she went from 15 to 89, huge upset. She managed to kind of say, okay, well, we need to be seen as responsible political actors here. And the strategy was called the strategy of a suit and tie. And so essentially, it's like, famously, David Cameron told Jeremy Corbyn, put on a suit, do your tie, and sing the national anthem, which is basically their strategy, look quite presentable. Sometimes they vote with the left, sometimes they vote with the centre, saying, we are responsible actors, we will support any bill which is in the national interest. And in contrast, you got the left, which kind of chose a kind of even like student style politics to National Assembly, making kind of big happenings in the National Assembly, kind of a lot of ruckus, a lot of noise. They chose kind of the opposite, we are a responsible party, we need to be responsible for our electorate and so on. So we come to now, she only has an extra 40 or 50 MPs. And what 2022 seemed to be suggesting is what we call le barrage républicain, anyone but Le Pen, was fragilizing. What we saw is actually the possibility of her getting a majority is actually essentially the closer she is to get a majority, the more people push back against it. When she's at 80 seats, people don't really care. I'm not going to bother voting for a centrist, I'm a leftist, blah, 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 or vice versa, because an extra, Le Pen MP is not that bad. A Le Pen majority and Le Pen government is a completely different kettle. So they kind of massively mobilized. So she has to kind of rethink her strategy, because this is not to go from like 140 seats or whatever to 289. Essentially, I crunched the numbers the other day. She would need to have won districts where her candidates were at 43% in the runoff. That's quite chunky, 43 to 57, because most of the freeway races ended up being a two-way. So that's considerable, and that's a lot of work to be done. Part of the issue is they kind of nominated weirdos. You'll get a kind of pro-Russian agent when the party's been trying to move away from that. You'll get someone like with a picture of her with a kind of Nazi cap. You'll get the kind of weirdos, or people just simply aren't apt to it. It's a tricky job. You'll be put under cameras quite a lot, and if there is a kind of weak link, it will be spotted. So the question is it kind of simply an issue of kind of changing personnel, being kind of a bit more ready for an election, or does she really need to see change in public support in order for that to happen? I'm not sure, but it's an interesting situation. That said, though, I said it was becoming a working class party. Over the last year or two, it managed to broaden its appeal quite a lot. Actually, the electoral base of Rassemblement National is probably the kind of most representative sample of French population. It used to be doing terribly with pensioners because it was supporting Brexit, leaving the EU. It's not so much the case nowadays. It's still doing a bit weaker with pensioners, but it's not that bad. She's doing really well with working age people. She's doing well with young people. She's doing quite well with all categories, even kind of more credentialed, kind of more knowledge-based economy workers. She's starting to break through. But one thing where she's kind of still struggling is big cities, Paris, Bordeaux, for example, Lyon, for example. She still struggles in those areas. And even in the north, for example, where she kind of basically does a home run, she can't touch Lille, which is, solidly in the hands of left. So that's one thing. But apart from that, if you look at the data of who is a Le Pen voter, at this point, in many parts of France, it could be anyone. We're not limited. It's also not very political in some way. Like, the people who would support Jean-Marie Le Pen, 40 years ago, they'd be like steeped in like Algérie française nostalgia. They'd be very, very political in their way of approach things. In many parts of France, the Le Pen vote is kind of normal. It's not. We're not talking about political junkies or kind of very weird, kind of racist people. A lot of them kind of pretty normal French people voting for her. And Jordan Bardella, the person who would have been prime minister, has helped because he's quite young. He's apparently doing a great hit on TikTok. I have no idea. I've never been on TikTok, but apparently he's very popular with kids there. So he's also managed to kind of extend the appeal a bit, and also kind of more kind of libertarian minded people like him a bit more. He's a bit more kind of a bit less statist than Le Pen, for example. So yeah, essentially it's a catch-all party with kind of pretty broad appeal. You mentioned an article I wrote for Unheard. I wrote one a bit before that, which argued that it wasn't a radical party. Now there's still elements of it which will be kind of a deviation from the kind of elite norms of politics, but it isn't a party which is, going for Frexit. On immigration, yes, it is quite hardline, but French population has become quite hardline on immigration, and even the current government has held quite hardline positions. They haven't always implemented them, but at least kind of positions have hardened as well. So it's a party which is increasingly treated normally by a lot of people, but not enough for them to be in power, and there is no chance of them getting in a coalition, and even the current chaos at the moment.
Hey, Francois, could you tell us a little bit more about Bardella? Because, I
Yeah,
mean, he's only, what, like 28 years
yeah, I
old?
think so.
So what's his background like, and what's his appeal to Le Pen voters?
So Le Pen made him. He started politics for the Rassemblement National when he was like 16, 17. He came from a pretty tough banlieue. I can't remember which one. I think his parents were Italian immigrants or descendants of Italian immigrants, plus for Bardella last name. So he came from a kind of a rough part of France. The Le Pens have always been seen as kind of, the gilded family of politics. They live in a mansion outside of a very nice mansion outside of Paris. Basically anyone in that kind of political group that isn't called Le Pen really kind of struggled to kind of get a more important role. He's different. He comes from this kind of he kind of represents this kind of new generation of Rassemblement National voters. He's quite slick. He's quite young. Even on stuff like Russia, there's like significant differences. I was reading an article from Politico the other day. For the last 2 years or so, he's been kind of having slightly different tune on Russia. Now, I think Putin, by invading Ukraine, has made kind of Putinophilia very difficult to assume, at least. 10 years ago, you'd have like French magazines on the right saying Putin is the man we need. He's, a strong man, defender of Christian values, blah, blah, blah. Nowadays, people wouldn't dare to do that anymore. But even then, like, they were a bit uncomfortable with that. They've been saying, well, obviously Ukraine is being attacked, but we don't want to go to war over Ukraine. We don't want to send too much equipment, blah blah blah. Bardella is pushing for kind of a bit more, maybe not pro-Ukrainian, but at least kind of anti-Russian line in a way that Le Pen is finds a bit more difficult. Famously, obviously, Le Pen, the party has been kind of chronically bankrupt for the last 10 years. It's finally digging itself out of that hole. So it had to take a loan from, I think, a Czech bank, which was actually funded by Russians. That created a lot of trouble. And back in 2022 for the presidential election, Le Pen was about to publish a leaflet. It was a kind of a big picture of her shaking hands with Putin. That leaflet had to be called back last minute because of invasion. But that's kind of show you how that party has evolved. Now, again, if you kind of dig in the dustbins of that party, you'll still find some kind of unsavory types. But at least the kind of front bench and kind of governing platform is not very radical, and they were so afraid of any backlash during their campaign that anything kind of too radical. For example, they wanted to um, lower the pension age from 64 to 62 again. That would have cost quite a lot of money. People started pushing back again. So they said, well, no, actually, we'll keep 64, but we'll mend it for people with longer careers, blah, blah, blah. So they've been so afraid of their own shadow during their campaign that anytime you've had even the slightest bit of pushback, they've said, actually, no, we're not going to do that. They used to be against dual citizenship. They said, actually, no, that's fine. We can keep dual citizenship. So it's a party which is kind of so desperate to go in power. It's, I don't think radicality is a kind of the North Star of that party. I think the North Star of that party is they want to get to a position of power, and they'll be ready to make a lot of compromises and sacrifices for it.
Is it just coincidental that Bardella is so young, or is that something that you see? Well, I guess I'll put it this way. I mean, I gather that there is something of a movement among younger people in Europe towards the right. Is that the case, sort of from your knowledge?
It is. So it depends what you call the right, but essentially, young people like kind of more radical options, and they're not going to vote for kind of a kind of boring centre right or boring centre left times. They'll go for kind of very radical options. Macron managed at some point to kind of capture that energy. But they'll vote for very kind of, they want change, they want revolution, they want something. And so that's why they vote for far left a lot more than the kind of national average, and for far right more than the national average. This is true also in Germany, for example. They don't want to vote for your grandparents' party. So for example, in Germany, the grandparents love the CDU, the centre right, and the SPD. That's the parties they grew up with, and they're kind of less comfortable with AfD, the Nationalist Party, or the Greens, for example. Kind of still, they've been around for a while, but still kind of a bit more of a newer party. And so, this is the case to some extent in the UK. People hate the Conservatives, young people especially, but some people will vote for Reform, the party of Nigel Farage. Another element of that kind of radicality of young people is actually, this is something I tweeted about a few months ago, which is really interesting. This is also the case in I think in America to some degree. Young people, historically, you had a gender split on political preferences. It wasn't a huge gender split, but women tended to be a bit more conservative than men. Not always true, but a kind of average, kind of a point or two more conservative than their husbands. Now, there's a lot of explanations for that, but one of it is women were a bit more religious and therefore a bit more conservative. That was kind of a basic explanation. That kind of faded out a little bit. I was looking at different countries. I was looking at France, at the UK especially. It started fading kind of the 80s and 90s with younger generations. What we're seeing nowadays with young people is kind of the opposite. Young men are a lot more conservative than young women. Young women will end up voting for kind of left-wing, far left, Greens, whatever. And young men will end up voting for far-right parties, much more radical options. I am not sure why. There's a lot of explanations for that. I think young men, there's a great book called Of Boys and Men by Richard Reeves, which I really recommend it. Young men are kind of struggling. And in a way that young women have their own issues for sure, but young men kind of academically aren't doing as well. The first few years into the workforce is quite tricky. Young women have issues around mental health and stuff like that, but kind of young men professionally and kind of where do I fit in society are increasingly kind of insecure and unsure about what they're supposed to do. There's a lot about how the kind of traditional understanding of masculinity is being kind of rewritten. It's a tricky world. I think feminism also, some forms of feminism can be quite polarizing, and kind of creates kind of tribal identities, for girls versus the boys. So there's a kind of an interesting element of that as well. I don't have the data for France. I have to check it, but I would suspect you would have some kind of gender polarization among kind of younger people. Then again, it depends what you call young people. Is it kind of 18, 25, in which case the left has an advantage, or is it 18 to 34, in which case Le Pen has an advantage? Essentially, Le Pen now has close to a majority, or at least a plurality of any kind of working age category in France. from like 25 to 62, she has got a majority. She kind of drops off a little bit with young people, and she drops off a bit more with pensioners.
Interesting. And so you to shift things a little bit, you wrote an article and heard about Macron's speech that he gave about the future of Europe.
Hmm.
And I thought that was really interesting. I mean, could you maybe for our listeners spell out what his vision is for the future of Europe? And then maybe, I mean, we could broaden this a little bit. What even for Le Pen's party is the vision, the future vision for Europe that you maybe more or less can make out?
Macron has had kind of a very lofty vision for Europe. When he emerged, I mean, he was a minister before that, but when he emerged as a political candidate in 2016, he thought that on the center right and on the center left, people had differences, but they also had things in common. One big thing was Europe, kind of strong belief in Europe being kind of our kind of second nation in a way, and a kind of real. There's kind of very French vision of Europe being a lever for French influence, but also kind of an attachment to kind of, this is one of the great ideals that France has left, which is, we could make a great European entity of which France will be a key player. So kind of borders between, politics and kind of idealism. The EU is a tricky institution to describe. People will love to kind of describe it as kind of a completely hapless organization, but at the same time as kind of a wannabe dictatorship. It's tricky. There's different institutions which kind of have different constituencies. You have, I'm not going to go through institutions. It's very annoying, very tricky. You can look it up online, but essentially you get, the heads of states are being represented, but also the people are being represented, but there's also kind of an executive of a commission. And so they have kind of different interests. They try to, and like all organizations, they try to survive and just by kind of pushing things through. Macron had a very kind of ambitious vision for Europe, saying, Europe needs to be a strategic player. It needs to be, he called it strategic autonomy. The idea was that Europe kind of saw itself as a herbivore in a world of carnivores, and it was quite proud of it. We'll all be vegetarians anyways in the next 20 years, so we don't need to play hardball politics like the Russians or the Americans, blah blah blah. Because for trade, through kind of liberal values, we'll be shaping the future, and the future will look a lot more like the European Union than it does to China, Russia, or something else. This was kind of very idealistic vision. Macron said, okay, we need to change that, and we need to actually make Europe a strategic actor because we've got interest defense. We can't simply say that, we're always better off doing trade, but also kind of, looking away when China is completely distorting trade, or when Trump or someone is playing hardball with us on European politics, also on international politics or international trade. So that was what Macron has been trying to push. So that was kind of very optimistic vision of that. And I think what he's been doing, I forgot exactly what he said. So let me just check the exact quote. I have it somewhere here. He's been talking about the death of Europe. Now, famously, there's a French poet called Paul Valéry, who wrote a poet in just after World War I, saying, "We civilizations now know that we are mortal." And so Macron is referring to that quote. So exactly. So Macron says, "We must be lucid about the fact that our Europe today is mortal. She can die. She can die. It only depends on our choices." The Paul Valéry quote was, "We modern civilizations have learned to recognize that we are mortals like the others." So very close, and the reference was very obvious. Essentially, what he was saying is, if we don't get our stuff together, we will be completely. I mean, this is like essentially the same argument, but kind of repackaged in kind of a much more kind of dark and negative way, saying if we don't get our stuff together, we will be completely flooded by history. And Paul Valéry in his it wasn't a piece of poetry. It was just I think an essay. He's saying that no, we've discovered great civilizations recently. Babylon, this is the start of archaeology and so on. We've discovered great civilizations, so fantastic civilizations. They probably thought they were immortal, and now they're gone. And so essentially, what Macron is saying is, no, we need to we need to move away from an era where we buy kind of energy from Russia, our stuff from China, and our security from America. So that's the idea. And I think there might be some kind of civilizational aspect behind it as well, but it's not fleshed out with Macron. Macron has kind of weird relationship to kind of this kind of civilizational issues. He's someone who has an interesting personal journey with faith. I don't think he was raised in a Catholic family, or if he wasn't a practicing one. But when he turned 15 or 16, he converted. And I don't think he's a Catholic anymore, but he was quite close to Paul Ricoeur, who was a Catholic thinker. And so there's this kind of influence on him sometimes, but it isn't maybe fully fleshed out. It's kind of in the background sometimes. So if there is a kind of civilizational aspect, it is less obvious. It is much more kind of much more political speech than a kind of civilizational speech.
That's very interesting, Francois, because my perception of Macron is he's just the quintessential technocrat. I mean, that he really embodies the kind of, I don't know what we'd even call it, but I mean, I know on your show you've talked about kind of the European Constitution, for example, as being, not really containing a definition of Europe that really would reflect its past. It could be anywhere, it could be anything. I mean, it could be Korea or Japan, or it could be anywhere, right? And so, I mean, I guess, something that Bobby and I are both very interested in as Americans, but as American, well, Bobby lives in Europe now, and, I used to live there myself. And, we're very, very interested in the European past and in what Pierre Manon calls the mark of Christianity, right? That is like sort of seemingly kind of ineradicable in Europe. And I just wonder if there are maybe especially younger people waking up to that and wanting to preserve that. And, if that's part of the interest that some may have in the so-called far right or other groups.
A little bit. I agree. So the 2005 Constitution was an important moment. It was supposed to give, it wasn't really a constitution, but we call it a constitution. It was supposed to give a real document to kind of define what Europe was and how it functioned. And a big controversy was about, the text wasn't mentioning kind of Christian roots, Christian values, and so on. I think Europe is a bit more than just Christianity, but obviously that's an important part. I think Paul Valéry said, I call Europe any territories that's been Christianized, colonized by the Romans, and as to the matter of the spirit or something, influenced by the Greeks. I completely butchered the quote, but something like that. And what is strange is those who are kind of big supporters of the European ideal are those also kind of least comfortable with that European past. That's a paradox, because I have a piece in mind which I'll try to write one day, but that's a real paradox, because if you seriously want Europe to be the kind of the future of Europeans, if you really want to kind of build that European nation, you'd have at some point to kind of go back to your history and say, okay, this is what we have in common between French and Romanians, Lithuanians and Portuguese. And there is a kind of a reluctance from kind of more centrist figures to do that. There is here and there you get a lot of references to Charlemagne, for example, or Carolus in German. There's some kind of nods here and there, but there isn't kind of a serious kind of reflection on what as Europeans unite us. And that's, I think, one of the kind of the driving themes in the podcast we do on Common Decency. We'll cover domestic events, we'll cover the French election, the British election for a moment, but there's like European moments, European figures, and kind of European ideas which kind of unite us. We, for example, did the revolutions of 1848. It's a remarkable moment where all of Europe is kind of responding to what's happening. Whereas the revolution kind of starts in Italy, but really kicks off in Paris, and people in Vienna are reading about it, and they're saying, what, we're unhappy with our situation, let's just flip the table as well here. And so then it has a ripple effect on Berlin and so on. It's a remarkable moment, which isn't studied much, because in the end, the revolutions
fail. It depends on the country, but they don't completely transform Prussia, for example, immediately, or they don't immediately transform Austria. But it's kind of moments like that, which I think aren't kind of really studied enough, and I think that's a shame. I don't think we are going to become a European nation anytime soon, but you'd think, if you look at if you look at countries like France, for example, famously there was a state before there was a nation, and the state spent a very long time kind of building that kind of national feeling, national identity, tapping into French history, tapping into the history of the Gauls, for example, the Gallic tribes. So it's a longer history, and you're right, it's not some history which is of interest as much as for people on the left. The paradox is the people who are most interested in that are people who also tend to be more often than not opponents of that European project on the right, the nationalists, or far right, whatever you want to call them. There are initiatives. I think people are getting more and more involved around heritage. Heritage is kind of a big angle for kind of young people to get involved. I know there is, over the last kind of 5 or 6 years, there's been kind of real push to help a lot of France's kind of collapsing churches and monasteries and even crosses. So that's an angle through kind of how people kind of, and if you go across Europe, you'll be struck by how many crosses and churches. It is something that is pretty uniform across the continent. So I think that's an angle where maybe young people have been getting involved a bit more. I know a few people actually who do that in France, but it's tricky as well because there's a realization increasingly, and that's why the Rassemblement National is a very secular party, which is, Christians, Catholics, especially practicing Catholics, are a minority, and not even a big minority out of that. If you kind of look a bit, more like Catholics in general, kind of cultural Catholics and so on, it's a bit wider, but practicing Catholics are what, 1-2% of the population. And it's the case in a lot of European countries, even countries like Poland, for example, which, used to be very fervent Catholic countries. That trend has completely shifted over the last 10 years or so. Look at Ireland, that happened a bit before Poland. Now, there are reasons for that. In the case of Ireland and Poland, I think that the church was a bit too close to political power, which I think becomes quite corrupting. But, in a country like France, we've kind of reached rock bottom on that front. There's like small signs here and there that there might be a revival. I think the number of ordinations this year of priests has increased by like 10-15%, which again, we're going from like 85 to 105 or something. I'm not even sure that's, that kind of increasing the flow is enough to kind of make up for the kind of decreasing stock, so to speak. I know the pilgrimage of Chartres, for example, has been a huge success this year. It's like small things here and there of a bit of a Catholic revival, but it's I think the number of Catholic catechumens has increased again as well, like 25%, which is quite considerable. But on the flip side, that also means that a lot of people would have been baptized at birth, aren't being baptized at birth anymore, and that's why they're getting baptized later on. So there are some elements of kind of a Catholic revival, but I think it's way too nascent. And again, it's when Catholicism in France has maybe not reached rock bottom, but close enough. There are still vibrant parishes. There are still kind of a lot of organizations going on. I went to World Youth Day actually, a year ago now. But a lot of French Catholics who were there. So there are stuff. There are small signs here and there, but it's increasingly we have to accept that we are moving within a kind of post-Christian universe. And something that might be of interest actually is, across the political spectrum, there's this kind of assumption that the kind of Catholics are kind of all kind of a bit more to the right than the kind of national average. It's complicated. The Catholics as a whole are, but interestingly, practicing Catholics, I have to check the data, maybe it's updated now, but practicing Catholics tend to be a bit more centrist. So you get kind of a nuanced picture of where Catholics are. And it's not like, we're not talking about kind of big monolith of Catholics choosing one party. Compared to Muslims, for example, who voted in the last presidential elections at kind of 65%, 70% for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Catholics are kind of a lot more kind of divided in their political opinions. But Yeah, sorry, this is a complete parenthesis here, but I thought that'd be of interest.
No, that's very helpful. Bobby, one more question for Francois from you.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting. A couple months ago, I was talking to a guy in Warsaw, and he's, I think, now like the dean of an economy school in Warsaw, and he spent some time, I think, at Oxford,
Mm,
studying economics. And one of his roommates, he was, unlike many Poles, he came from a very secular background. I think his
yeah.
family were Communist Party members. But his roommate was a practicing Muslim.
Mm,
And he told me this because he had a conversion out in England, that he was so impressed by the devotion of
yeah.
his Muslim roommate that inspired him to explore his own, and so if you want to say, I don't want to call it European, but the heritage of Christianity. And so
Yeah.
that it wasn't Islam that he was attracted to, but it was then it led him to Catholicism. So I wonder if there's, if any of that is going on in the case
Mm,
of France, maybe not just a hostile reaction to Islam, or maybe just a kind of, if you want to say, uncritical embrace of it, but perhaps maybe there's an appreciation for the
mm.
devotion that may be leading to this exploration of their own heritage.
That's a good question. There are certainly kind of individual cases here and there. I don't think it's a general trend. I think if anything, there's been kind of a weaponization of kind of Catholicism as a response of,
Mm.
kind of, the Muslims are coming, we need to defend our faith. When people who talk about Christendom instead of Christianity, kind of you're kind of using you're kind of LARPing something which isn't really here.
Mhm.
People who sometimes aren't really believers, but they want to defend a cause against the invading Muslims. Um, I'm not sure there's been a revival of faith. Now, to be fair, this kind of weaponization, um, I think most of the way the nationalists have been critiquing Islam, and sometimes for good reasons. We've done a few podcasts with, kind of on the fringes of Islam, there's kind of a large minority of very radical, very dangerous, even kind of violent and terrorist organizations. But the way kind of a lot of kind of people on the radical right have been responding to Islam hasn't been through Christian values, but through what some people have been calling kind of a weaponization of liberal values. If you look at someone like Geert Wilders, for example, in the Netherlands, I hope I'm not butchering his name, people like him aren't critiquing Islam in the name of Christianity. They are critiquing Islam because they are, against individual rights for women, for LGBT people, and so on and so on. So that's been an interesting evolution in the discourse. In Marine Le Pen, will be quite close to that. Again, I'm not saying there isn't, anything of concern within some circles of Islam, but I don't think it's stirred something within Christianity, apart from a few people kind of LARPing Christendom versus, the Crusades all over again. But I think that's right. I think there is something to be said about the people, how people live their faith in Islam, which should be a source of inspiration. I think a lot of Catholics may be a bit ashamed of their faith. I'm not saying we should go outside and pray 5 times a day. But maybe there's a way of, being proud about it without being loud about it, which we probably need to find a way to embrace. I think Catholics kind of have a bad rap, but I think there's quite often people. Well, actually, I'm gonna step back on this. I'm actually quite surprised. My natural response when I say I'm Catholic, I'm expecting kind of people to be kind of a bit hostile. But increasingly, since we live in such a de-Christianized world, the reaction is like, "Oh, what is that like?" And actually, I kind of, oh, actually, I'm sometimes struggling to explain what my faith is because I'm not used to people kind of being curious about what's going on, And that's
Mhm.
something which I think is quite new. because we went from being in kind of a very Christian world where people were, very familiar with that universe, that allowed them to be also kind of very critical if it wanted to. But nowadays we've kind of moved on. And that's maybe an opportunity as well for Christians to kind of actually, there's a lot of people out there who can be quite curious. I've got a few people in my family who are priests. I even have a bishop. And quite often, some of them just, like to be a bit provocative. I'm exaggerating here, but they like to show up, in their kind of in their uniform, as my uncle would like to say. And people aren't really hostile, and like people like they tell me, that you're in a very fancy party, and you get this kind of very confident 35-year-old man making a lot of money in finance, pretty confident guy who kind of opens up and talks about all his uncertainties and kind of unprompted. And there is a kind of sometimes kind of yearning that people kind of don't realize, and that Christians sometimes don't realize as well. And that's an opportunity, post-Christian world, which I think I've been seeing in my personal level. Maybe I'm generalizing too much, but I think that's something that could be interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for your personal perspective there, in addition to kind of your wearing your political analyst cap there. On that note, François, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Again, our guest has been François Valentin, who is the host of the Uncommon Decency podcast, and you can check out his writings over at Unheard. To all of our listeners and viewers, thank you so much for joining us. Please do rate and review this podcast, share it, and until next time, God bless and live in hope.